Okay? Mostly what you're seeing when you put the heat on is just superficial tissues getting blood flow. The deep stuff doesn't get a hell of a lot of change. Okay? So some hot and some cold is a little exploration for the athlete. Normally they'll feel a little less painful if they ice something acute. Okay? But the thing that I want you to also reiterate to the athletes is that when you feel a little better with some ice or some heat, move gently. Not stretch aggressively, but move gently. So if, for example, you're walking with a limp and you put some ice on it and it feels a little better, just walk gently and so that you walk without a limp. Or do a little squatting up and down in a pain-free range after you've done that icing. You will not be damaging, by having a numb tissue, you'll not be damaging that structure. You're only going to move in the range that the pain system allows you to. Okay? The icing doesn't create changes down at the bone. It doesn't penetrate that deep. It's just superficial nerves that you're mostly hitting in the top layers of the muscles and the joints. Okay? So don't be afraid to just move a little gently because you want to promote movement. Number one thing in an acute injury is start to promote healthy movement at the level that they can. Okay? It's not go home and run, but it's promote healthy movement. Okay? It's a big, broad stroke answer to the question, but hopefully that helps you.
All right, so we're going to shift gears a little bit. We've already gone about 2 hours, so we have 2 hours left, and we still have a lot of information to get through and a lot of stuff to play with out in the gym. So we're going to go through this pretty quickly. If you have questions, raise your hand, and we'll explain as much as we can with the time that we have. Before we get into it, I want to give you just a little bit of information about my background. So I actually played football at Penn State. I never ran. Running was a punishment for us. And in 2004, I started working with Alberto Salazar, doing a lot of the rehab for his athletes. And in 2010 or 11, he asked me to come on and do all the strength and conditioning, all the rehab, all the re-injury prevention, which Matt and I have been working on since you joined us, which was 2000. Doesn't matter.
14, something like that.
So I come from a power sport. I come from football. I played football at Penn State. And when I entered the world of strength and conditioning for running, and I started to look at the sports research, it seemed apparent to me that what we needed to do with runners was optimize power per kilogram body weight. Because even though it doesn't seem like endurance athletics is a power sport, it really is. Because ultimately we want short contact times, large flight times, which means we have to put a lot of power into the ground in a very short amount of time, which is the expression of power. And lucky for me, Alberto was an early adopter of this concept that runners need to lift hard and heavy in order to get that adaptation. The historical methodology around lifting for endurance runners, I think there's been an apprehension because runners don't want to be big. They don't want to be stronger and more powerful at the expense of having more tissue and more body mass that they have to maneuver around the track, which I appreciate. But there are actually two ways that we get adaptation when we start to do strength work. We have neurological adaptation and we have physiological adaptation. Physiological adaptation is the actual physical adaptation of tissue. So if you get under a squat bar and you squat X amount of weight, X times per day, or X times per week over the course of X months, you can facilitate hypertrophy of the muscle. You get increase in protein synthesis. So your muscle gets bigger and you can create more strength. That's great, but maybe not optimal for an endurance athlete that has to move their body across the ground at very high speeds for a very long amount of time. The second mode of adaptation is called neurological adaptation, where you can actually increase the ability to produce strength and power without getting physiological adaptation. So we can get power adaptations and keep the body at the same size. You know, guys like Mo and Galen and Centro, you know, they can back squat about twice their body weight, so about 230 pounds, and they can deadlift about 230 pounds, and they are not getting bigger, and we know this because we do circumferential measurements, body weight measurements, and we send them into the Nike lab to do body comps all the time. Research came out recently that shows that if you are doing endurance athletics at a high enough proportion per week, you actually have this physiological phenomena called the interference effect, where you get the neurological adaptation from strength and conditioning work and power work, but you don't get the physiological adaptation. That the stimulus for the protein synthesis is a little bit inhibited. So we can get a lot of strength and power adaptation without creating hypertrophy. So that's my background, and over the past, since 2011, it seems like it's worked pretty well for us. Our guys have won a lot of medals. So that's my background. Now we're gonna get into it. So I like to keep things relatively simple, and just by show of hands, who was at the Nike event this couple of weeks ago, the Coaches Symposium? Okay, so some of this will be a little bit redundant, but for a lot of you, it seems like you haven't seen this before. So there's a guy named Al Vermeil who's a strength and conditioning coach and is amazing. He's in the Hall of Fame for strength and conditioning. He's won NBA championships. He's won NFL championships with various teams. Unbelievable. He reduced this concept of strength and conditioning into this pyramid that he calls the hierarchy of athletic development. And it's very simple, so I always use it with my athletes, with my coaches, and we're going to talk about it today. So the base of the pyramid is symmetry and balance. It's just the ability to do work in a way that is efficient and symmetric. So this is all of your range of motion work. This is the dynamic warm-up. This is the foam roller stuff. This is going to be what we go into in the gym in the next hour, which is going to be basic hip strengthening and core strengthening. All of this goes into symmetry and balance, just building the capacity to have a solid, stable, functioning, durable body. And for our strength and conditioning program with the Organ Project, about 50% of the volume of any one lift is in this category of exercises that are really boring that you never see them posted on Instagram, like we talked about earlier. These are the things that we want your athletes to do. These are the things that they don't want to do because they're boring and they suck, and I get it, but they're imperative. So we're going to talk about these. We're going to do a lot of these out in the gym. So that's symmetry and balance. Once you have a system that is balanced, symmetrical, they're durable, they move well, they have good quality movement, then you can start to load them. So that's when strength comes into play. So that's when you use external load to get a strength adaptation. And we're going to talk about some of the exercises that go into this category. One thing to note though, let me see if my pointer works. Oh, it doesn't work on the TV. It works up there though. One thing to note though is that if you don't have a symmetric and balanced body athlete, you don't want to start to load them. Because if you load somebody with imbalances, you're going to strengthen their imbalance. So we need to create a lot of emphasis on this block before we move somebody up the chain. And it might be that for some of your high school kids or kids before high school, might not use any external load until they get to maybe sophomore, junior, or senior, which is totally fine. You'll get a lot of benefit just working in this category, and there's a lot of exercises in that category. When it's appropriate, then you start to add load to them. So that's strength, and we'll talk about what those look like. Once you have strength, you can start to add some power elements, which we're going to talk about as well. And these are like the power cleans, some split squats. You can do some kettlebell work. And for the most part, the stronger you are, the more powerful you're going to be, but it doesn't automatically translate. So once you have a strength base, you need to add some power elements in order to translate the strength to power, because that ultimately leads to speed. And as you can see here, only about 25% of what we do with our Organ Project athletes is in the strength category, and only about 15% is in the power category. So we don't do a lot of this. I think the impression is that our guys do a lot of power work and a lot of strength work, and they don't do the boring stuff, and I'm here to tell you that that's not true. So tell your kids. So we'll talk about these a little bit more specifically, but we won't have a lot of time. Once you have a good base of symmetry and balance, you've added some strength, you've added some power, then you can start to add some plyometric elements. And we know from a lot of research that adding plyometrics to endurance athletes is going to significantly increase their ability to perform, to have a peak performance. However, if you start to add plyometrics before you have strength, power, or symmetry and balance, you're asking for an injury. These are incredibly dangerous exercises, which is okay. Exercises are dangerous. That's why the body adapts. Your body adapts to stress. So all that we're doing from a strength and conditioning standpoint and what you are doing from a coaching standpoint is we are dosing stress and asking the body to adapt to it. And we do that over and over again, and we increase the stress, we get more adaptation, we increase the stress, we get more adaptation over the course of a season, they get faster over the course of a career, they get faster. So exercises are inherently dangerous, and that's why they're effective, okay? But plyometrics can be extraordinarily dangerous because you're ballistically challenging tissue. So we need to make sure that we don't add plyometrics until we've added these other elements, and we have competency in those elements.
So you mentioned for endurance athletes, does the same thing hold true for, our speed and power kids?
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, for sprinters, for jumpers, yeah, the same. sprinters and jumpers will end up doing a little bit more work in the power and the plyometric because they need power and they don't need to have efficient. It depends on the coach. And we'll talk about how this is kind of organized over the course of a season in the next slide. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But what the athlete, what their event is going to change the proportionality of a lot of this stuff. For our marathoners like Galen and Jordan, we're still doing some strength work, but we're not doing power work anymore. And we still do a little bit of plyometric work just because they have to be incredibly efficient over the course of 26.2 miles. Sprinters, I was talking to John Smith, who's one of Nike's top sprint coaches, and he said, I just want power. I don't care if it's efficient. My guys need to be powerful for less than 10 seconds. So their strength and conditioning reflects what they need to do on the track.
So like PE class is mandatory in my high school.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of kids in athletic weight training or weight training classes, and they're working strength, power, plyometrics, and they're freshmen in high school that need symmetry and balance. If I hammer that in practice, can that combat what they're training wrong?
God, that's such a good question. Yeah.
But they're not ready for it.
One of the unfortunate things about kids is that they're durable and they can do things wrong for a long time. But the longer they do things wrong, they build up these bad motor programs, and then eventually it's going to bite them in the ass. And I was talking to the strength coach at University of Portland, Brad Scott, a while ago, and he had told me that a lot of times he's getting these kids in, and the entire first year he is detraining their bad habits. And then he can start to train them good habits. But he has to strip things down, teach good motor programs, and then strengthen the good motor programs. Just like we were talking about in the gym, if you do the dynamic warm-up and you do it with attention and focus and movement quality, you get a lot of value there. If you just let kids move the way that they want to move, then they're wasting their time, So, does that answer your question?
Yeah. So if we try to correct symmetry and balance or strengthen that the best we can, am I going to get lucky with them in their weight training class if I don't see them?
You might.
They'll get better?
You might. The good thing about a lot of the symmetry and the balance work you can do in practice, and they should be doing at home. Like over the summer, there's a whole category of things that they should just be doing on a consistent basis every week if they want to be a runner. And a lot of my guys do that. A lot of Dave Frank's kids, I think that he has obviously a great program. His kids are working all year, and they're accountable for certain things that they do, and they are accountable to having done that before they come to practice. So he doesn't get kids that come in the first day of track and they haven't run all summer and they haven't done any strength work. Those kids are working. So some of this stuff they can do on their own. Having a conversation with the strength coach potentially, or the gym teacher, and saying, here is the strength and conditioning program for my athletes. Is it possible to integrate this stuff into their gym program? And the gym teacher might love it, he or she might hate it, who knows, but it's probably worth a conversation. As long as they know that there's structure behind it and there's intention behind it, then you might be surprised.
Two-part question piggybacking on that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times in those types of strength and conditioning classes, especially when I was in high school, it was kind of the football program and you do it or you move on and do another class.
Mm-hmm.
But whether there's a point where you stop increasing weight and start doing increase in reps,
Mm-hmm.
as well as just doing high weight, low reps, or low weight, high reps.
Mm-hmm.
I was always a proponent of low weight, high reps,
Mm-hmm.
just to keep people from getting too big. And
Yeah.
yeah.
That's a good question, and I'll answer that in a couple of different variations. I would prefer to see kids moving well before they get loaded, obviously. I think a lot of times we don't have that luxury, because a lot of times kids are doing a lot of load because they want to, they see it on Instagram, or other coaches are making them do that. An expectation for me would be that when a kid who has a lot of talent, who is durable, by the time they graduate high school, if they can squat and deadlift 100% of their body weight, so 1 times their body weight, so if they weigh 150 pounds, they can back squat 150 pounds or deadlift 150 pounds. I think that's an appropriate expectation for a kid that has gone through multiple years of a strength and conditioning program as a runner. I'm not a proponent for high school kids to be doing things that are close to their 1 rep max on a consistent basis if they're going to be a runner, because it's possible that high school runners aren't running the amount of volume that they need to have that interference effect to prevent them from getting hypertrophy. So I would be more of a proponent for high school kids doing a little bit less weight, a little bit higher reps over the course of their career. Once they get a little bit older and they're logging more miles per week, then I think we can start to add a little bit more load because they're more skeletally mature. they're stronger, their tissue is going to be more durable, and they're going to be able to tolerate more resistance on a consistent basis as an augment to what they're already doing. You know, like our guys in the Oregon Project are running 100, 120 miles a week. Strength and conditioning is an ancillary part of their training. So I need to make sure that they're durable, that they can tolerate loads on a fatigued system. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, tiny extra question.
Mhm.
So if they're doing like a 3x8 for, you know, a reasonable amount of weight, say they're doing 45s on either side of the
Sure.
bench, what would an alternative to that be for like a lower weight? Like, would
So
it
there's-
be 15 reps of half that weight? Or-
Yeah, so there's a great diagram that I don't have in this presentation, but I'll pull it up when we take the next break or at the end, or you can come talk to me at the end. There's this thing called the Odvard-Holtman diagram, which is all based on 1 repetition max, which is how we kind of gauge weight. And as you go down this kind of a sloped pyramid, it'll tell you the expectation of if you're lifting 95% of your 1 rep max, you should be able to do 3 reps. If you're doing 65% of your 1 rep max, you can do 16 reps. So that's all very predictive, and it's actually remarkably reliable and consistent. And there are apps on your phone that if you know what one of your athletes' 1 rep max lift is, then you can start to scale back and give them an appropriate rep range. So yeah, we'll talk about that. All right, so we got to get moving. So after you work on plyometrics, ultimately speed develops. Okay, so this is what we see a lot of times with the athletes that come in, even professional athletes. They do so much work in strength, power, plyometric to work on speed, and they neglect the symmetry and the balance that the base of their pyramid becomes very unstable and they get injured. And that's why they come in and see us as physical therapists and not as strength and conditioning coaches. So some examples of symmetry and balance are core work, basic hip work, dynamic flexibility, foam roller, all the stuff that we've already played with a little bit, and then some single leg balance work where we start to add a little bit of load. We're going to play with these out in the gym. Some strength exercises, squat variations, front squat, back squat, deadlift variations. There's a lot of different variations for deadlifts. Rear foot elevated single leg squat, which was made popular by Mike Boyle, a strength coach out of Boston. And there's a lot of really good research that shows that this translates to functional strength and power application better than just squats. And it's nice because you do less load because you're on one leg, so it's safer and it's even more applicable to what you're trying to get your athlete to do. So I'm starting to migrate more towards this variation of strength development than traditional squats. We still do it, but we add a lot of this stuff in, which kids are going to be able to do sooner than heavy work under a bar anyway. Power exercises. So normally when we're working on power, we are decreasing the weight, but we're increasing contraction velocity because we want power is basically force in a reduced amount of time. So if we reduce the weight and we increase the speed of the exercise, then we start to make the power adaptation, which is really kind of the neurological adaptation. So this is Galen doing what we call split squats, and he's doing 95 pounds. He weighs about 130 pounds. So this is still a considerable amount of weight for a kid that weighs 130 pounds. Let's see if this plays.
I got questions.
Yeah.
Would he ever leave his feet, doing those?
I don't have athletes leave their feet when they have this kind of weight, but you'll see him moving pretty quick. I mean, he's exploding up. He's just not leaving his feet. And the intent is not for the weight to leave his shoulders. It just happens to be leaving his shoulders, and I know that he's durable, so I let him do that. And he might do 3 or 4 sets of 6 of these. And sometimes we'll pair this with some box jumps so that we get a power exercise, and then we create even less weight, no weight, but an increased contraction velocity, and we let him leave the ground. So that's where the jumping comes in. We pair it up in what's called a complex.
So David, why are his feet split like that? What's the advantage and what's happening with the
Similar to the rear foot elevated single leg squat, the one that I just showed you that Mike Boyle does a lot of. Because that is more applicable to running because you have one foot putting force into the ground. It's an increased balance challenge. Yeah, we just have more load because for him, at that point, he'll have about 85% of his load on the front foot. The back foot is just basically keeping balance. And as he comes up, the intent is that as he comes up, his pelvis is coming forward just like you would when you're running. So we're trying to make this as applicable to running as we possibly can.
One of the terms that Dave and I mucked around with probably a year and a half ago is scissoring, is this idea of closing and opening the hips at the same time. And we look at it on our video analysis, and we're doing it with the strength and conditioning work as well. That essentially we're saying when one leg is trailing and the other one's in front, you may have predominant load on the front leg, but you're never neglecting the fact that the trailing leg is contributing to front leg stability and strength. So your closing speed, your ability to close the scissors, comes from the hip flexors on the trailing leg with the glutes and the hamstrings and the quads on the loaded leg. So there's that sense of bringing those two together as you're bringing the pelvis up. Yeah.
And we do a lot of work in a lunge position, which you'll see as we go through more of the work later today, because I think the lunge position is a few more standard deviations closer to running than like a symmetrical squat position or a deadlift position, because we're always trying to encourage a stride angle or a scissor angle where we have good extension in this hip while we have good flexion in this hip and have good stability of the pelvis in that position. So we do a lot of work in the lunge position and in lunge variations, which is another reason that we use this.
Yeah, kids who can't do that.
Yeah.
Why? Holding on to the weight?
Yep.
Or medicine ball in the air, or what would be that?
Yep, you can hold on to a medicine ball in the air. You can hold on to some weights at your side, dumbbells or kettlebells. Any load. You don't even need load. You know, I mean, a lot of kids can do this and just power their way up and get really good power adaptation. So you got to meet the kid where they are. Some plyometric examples. So box jumps. This is Centrowitz jumping out in the gym. Kind of repetitive jumps and bounds. Plyometrics is not just for the feet. This is kind of a plyometric core exercise, rotational core exercise. We're going to play with this out in the gym. Skills and drills, A skips, B skips. I mean, these are low level plyometrics, but it's still ballistic loading to tissue, and you're going to get a plyometric response to it. And kids are able to do this at very young ages. So this is a safe flavor of plyometrics that you can start to integrate sooner. Ladder drills, we like to do a lot of ladder drills. Some of my athletes like ladder drills more. Like Shannon Roberry has a very high cadence. She comes from a dancing background. Her cadence is about 200 strides per minute, which is really high. At her race pace. So she knows that that's an advantage for her. She's like the road runner. So we do a lot of plyometric work with her to augment what she knows is one of her strengths against her competition. But these are great. Kids love these, and you get some really low level plyometric loading. It teaches coordination. You can work on body posture and shape like Matt was talking about. So these are really good. Okay, so this is MoFar. I just threw this in there because I think it's interesting. You can do this thing at a certain point in training called complex training, where you can do a strength element, a power element, and a plyometric element. He likes this. The sprinters like this. This stuff has been around in sprinting and in other sports for a long time. All we're doing is we're applying it to endurance runners, and we find that it actually works. I mean, nobody can beat Mo in the final kick because he can run like a sprinter in the last 100 meters. And one of the big reasons is because we do a lot of heavy power lifting with him, because it's appropriate for him. So here's him, I'll start the video. So here's him doing 205 pounds deadlifts, and I have him do it from an elevated position. I never let my guys do a deadlift from the bar on the ground, the weight on the ground, because I'm not trying to make these guys deadlifters, I'm trying to make them faster runners, and that's a dangerous position. So then he goes into 95-pound power cleans, and he weighs about 125 pounds, so this is a decent amount of weight for him. His form is not great, but I've worked with him for about 8 years and he's never gotten injured, so he's durable enough that I let him be a little sloppy. And then he'll go right into box jumps. So he'll do 3 or 4 rounds of this, and I'll give him adequate break in between each one of these clusters. And he loves this, and he responds really well to it. And your kids in high school aren't going to be able to do the same amount of weight, but they can do a similar style of lifting at a certain phase of the season. All right, so we don't have a lot of time to get into this. I'm going to talk about it briefly, but we've got to move on. We don't do everything all the time in equal proportion. Over the course of a season, and this is how you probably organize and periodize your track work as well. You do volume in the front half, you start to do a little bit less volume, a lot more speed at some point, and then you start to taper for a race. So periodization and strength and conditioning is basically just how you organize the elements of the program and phase things in and phase things out. So in general, over a 7-month cycle, like we would use for my organ project athletes, we do a lot of symmetry and balance for the first couple of months. We don't do a lot of strength work, we don't do any power work, and we don't do any plyometric work. So we go back to the basics. All the boring stuff that all your kids should be doing are the boring things that my athletes are doing. If you look at their Instagram accounts, this is when they're not posting stuff about their strength and conditioning program because it's not fun stuff, it's boring, but they do it. And then for another couple of months, we'll start to phase in some strength work. We keep a lot of the same symmetry and balance work. We might phase in some different flavors of the symmetry and balance work, but that stays in there. We add a little bit of strength, and then as we get deeper into the season, we start to add some power elements. We'll come back on the strength a little bit, add a little bit of power work, and then we go into the peak season. So we organize things so that we don't allow our athletes to get stale. They do the same things every lift, every day, every week, every month. They're going to stop responding to the stimulus. So you need to change it up. You need some variability. And this is just one flavor of periodization. There's a lot of other methods for periodization. This one is a pretty simple one to follow. So if you do it right, so this is Jordan Hasse, and I started working with her 9/22/2012 when she was still in college. Her parents reached out to me and asked me if I would work with her. So I would meet her in Salem, and we would lift either once a week or once every 2 weeks, and then she would do the program during the time that we were not together. And then she joined the Oregon Project and ended up making the World Championship team. She finished second in the 10K. And what you'll see is between 9/22/2012 and 5/1/2013, she makes an incredible transition in her running mechanics. And in this period, we weren't doing a lot of strength work. We were doing a lot of work in symmetry, balance, dynamic warm-up, dynamic flexibility, and just doing the basics. And you'll see that she makes a radical transition, not because we're asking her to change her form, but because we give her the right strength and flexibility components for her body to naturally migrate in that direction.
So we're looking at Jordan Hasse's form.
So this is relatively at the same speed, and you can tell here she's just kind of heavy. Her knees aren't getting very high. She has a very low recovery angle. Her heels aren't getting to her butt. She doesn't seem very poppy and elastic. And then this one on the right, it looks like almost a totally different runner. And this is just because we've given her the components to do it.
There's been a significant form change, with just not looking nearly as heavy
Her stride count
on the right, on the left.
I could go in and look. I think her cadence went up a little bit. Yeah.
Get very good extension to the backside of her mechanics.
All right.
Shoulders are definitely.
So
So did you anticipate that change, or were you surprised when you saw that video?
I anticipated a change because we see that a lot when we bring athletes into the Oregon Project and we start to put them on a very kind of strategic, periodized, individualized program. I didn't expect to see that radical of a change in an athlete that was already pretty incredibly talented. So it was unique, so I pull it up there. Huh?
It's a good slide.
Yeah.
And with kids, it's even better. They come in looking like floppy donuts, and 6 weeks later, you haven't told them to change anything about the way that they move, and they move differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of that comes from just the strength and conditioning. You know, that doesn't come from more volume. It doesn't come from more hill sprints. It doesn't come from her intellectually trying to conceptually change her mechanics based on this ideal form that she thinks she has in her head. It comes because when you give an athlete better strength, better power, better postural awareness, better core stability, better hip strength, better plyometric capacity, their body's going to naturally find the most efficient way to run. So she's finding a more efficient way to run because she has a body that can run more efficiently and more plyometrically and more ballistically and faster. So it's pretty cool. Oh, okay, so central stability. So this is huge. Keeping the pelvis stable, whether you're a sprinter or a runner or a basketball player, having total control of your pelvis is imperative. It's imperative. I would have used core stability, but core stability I think comes with baggage, and it's more than just the core. So keeping the pelvis stable is imperative. When we know that the better job we do in strength and conditioning for our endurance athletes, and the better we can control somebody's pelvis, we get a direct correlation to decreased contact time, increased flight time, increased rate of force production, decreased injury rates. A lot of this stuff is pretty well outlined in the research. If somebody has a sloppy pelvis, then we have longer contact time, lower force, lower flight time, and ultimately they're slower. I mean, you can reduce running to physics, basic physics, and then you can kind of backtrack and make strength conditioning and adaptations from there. So we spend a lot of time doing work to strengthen the pelvis. So central stability. Here's a definition from Ben Kibler, who's a physician out of Louisville, Kentucky. Stability, and he says, is the ability to control the position and motion of the trunk over the pelvis to allow optimum production, transfer, and control of force and motion of the terminal segment in an integrated athletic activity. So stability is a bit of a misnomer. Stability is just not strength. Stability is a combination of range of motion. Well, here we'll just go on to the next one. So it's motor control, it's strength, and it's mobility. So we need to have appropriate range of motion of the tissues that connect to the pelvis. We need to have appropriate strength of the tissues that connect to the pelvis that are moving the body through space. We need to have appropriate motor control to coordinate the strength and utilize the flexibility in a way that makes it efficient. So this becomes a little bit harder than just doing a bunch of sit-ups. But we're going to talk about this stuff. Here's what becomes even more challenging. When we're talking about pelvic stability, there are 45 muscles that attach to the pelvis. And if any of them are tight and or weak and or neurologically inhibited and or just not sequencing well, it's going to decrease your ability to generate power. So you can increase strength, increase power, and increase efficiency just by coordinating a little bit better and giving them the appropriate range of motion with dynamic flexibility and foam roller work. So the foam roller work and the dynamic flexibility is not just for injury prevention. It's to give you the mobility component of those 3 circles that translates into performance, optimal performance. So here's just a list of a handful of them. We'll keep moving forward. Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, Matt and I were teaching a course to a bunch of physical therapists, and central stability was a big topic that we talked about. And I was working with Mo, and he said something that was perfect, so I made him say it again, and I caught it on video. So see if you can decipher it. I'll tell you what he says, but...
Say it again for the record. Life is a bitch and then you die.
Not that.
What you just said about lifting.
I thought that you said we had to look corn. It's been corn all day, please.
So if you couldn't hear it, he says, Dave, I thought we were lifting, not coring. We've been coring all day. Because we do. About 50% of what we do is either isolated or integrated core and hip work. And then we do the strength and the power and the plyometric work. But we do a lot of the stuff that, as I said, you never see on Instagram. So I thought that was perfect, so I pulled it off. Okay, so concept of isolation and integration, we're going to fly through this because we have about an hour and a half at this point. So we'll start with the concept. So this is also work done by Ben Kibler, and he was doing work with baseball players. And he outlined this concept that kind of speaks to this idea of the kinetic chain, that you have a lot of elements within your body that create force, that force gets summated, and then you create total power of the entire system. So in running, you have the foot creating strength, the ankle creating strength, the knee creating strength, the hip creating strength. They're all building on each other, transferring the load from one segment to the other, all the way up the kinetic chain in order to get a lot of force in a short amount of time into the ground. So this is what happens when everything is sequenced well and you have all the elements working in good synergy. So if we take this and we reduce it down to a simpler concept, if we have a bunch of blocks and the blocks are all stacked up against a force transducer, so this is measuring how much force is coming out the other end. And we have a hammer that hits this end of the block. So we have the spine, the core, the pelvis, the hip, the knee, the foot. So the hammer hits this and we get transfer of force from the spine all the way through the system into the force transducer. This is a system that works really well. We're transferring force appropriately through the entire system so that the force that is being generated in the system is being put into the ground or into the force transducer. Now what happens if we have an element within this system, like the hip, that's no longer a concrete block, it's a foam block. So now we hit the spine, we translate the spine from the spine, or translate the force from the spine to the core to the pelvis, it hits the hip and it all gets dissipated. So then we can't transition all of that force into the foot because we've lost it in the hip. The hip becomes a dysfunctional segment within the kinetic chain. It becomes more complicated than that because we're not just transferring force from one joint to the other. Each joint is also creating force as the force is transitioning through. So we have a little hammer hitting a little spike on the spine, and at the very precise moment that that force is transitioning through the core has a little hammer that hits the spike that creates a little bit more force, and that gets transitioned through. So you get a summation of forces as force travels through the body from segment to segment, so that ultimately we get maximal force production at the other end in the force transducer. So that's what it looks like when you have a healthy system, when you have all these blocks that are healthy and strong and flexible and they're in good synergy and they're contracting at the right time, and we have a lot of force in a little bit of time. So we have a fast runner. If we have a hip that's dysfunctional, all of a sudden we start to lose force, so we get less force in a longer amount of time. And that's a recipe for slow. That's what me and Matt are at this point. We have a lot of broken segments. So We isolate and we integrate because we know from a lot of research that we need to have this chain look a very predictable way. We need to have very strong hips. We need to have a very strong core. So we can do exercises to specifically strengthen the hip. Exercises that are, as I said, boring. Clamshells, reverse clamshells, lateral leg lifts, the stuff that nobody wants to do. But we know that we can really bolster the strength and the durability of that segment so that then when we do a functional exercise, an integrated exercise, then we can integrate the strength that we build in the isolation work into the totality of the force summation. So that's why we isolate and we integrate. So the isolation stuff, as I said, is like the clamshells. It's the ground-based stuff. It's where we're taking just one collection of tissue, in this case, the hip abductors and external rotators, and we're just trying to get them strong with repetition, load, and frequency. So we get them stronger and stronger and stronger. And then we integrate them into a more functional exercise that looks a little bit closer to running. And we teach this in a way that we make sure that the glutes are contributing. Because you can do this exercise and not use your glutes. You can have weak glutes and do this exercise. So if you just have a kid do an exercise that is supposed to get the glutes, because you're using the entire functional chain, your body is smart enough to do the exercise without challenging the glutes. So that's why we strengthen the glutes, then we integrate it into an integration exercise. Does that make some sense conceptually?
And you do that subsequently, like in the same workout because you're activating?
Yeah. So we always do, in any one workout, we'll do some isolation work. Normally we do that on the front end to get things active and to get things kind of firing and get things maybe a little bit fatigued. And then we'll go into some integrated work. So we do a lot of the single leg balance work, which we're going to do some out in the gym. And then we'll go into the strength work, like work under the bar or the power work or the plyometric work. So that's how we normally stage it and sequence it. But we always do some isolation work, whether it's core. We always do some isolation core, isolation hips, some integration core, integration hips.
David, is that the hot salsa?
Yeah, that was the hot salsa, which we're going to talk about out there, which is it's a modified lunge. You only have one picture of a moving exercise, so it's hard to really see what's going on, but we'll talk about that out there. So isolate, integrate, then you dominate. I just wanted a third slide. If you go through this process and your kid doesn't win a gold medal in 2020, money back guaranteed. Sometimes. All right. So that's it. Let's do a couple quick questions, and then we'll go out and we'll do a collection of hip isolation exercises, a collection of isolation integration for the hip, isolation integration for the core. And we're also going to do some of the functional exercises and talk about the strength and power work as well. Any questions that we didn't answer?
Going back to your slide of starting in September and then building up to March. At my high school is pretty small, so I have kids that are doing football, basketball, then we jump into track. So how do you incorporate all of that together?
Yeah. That's really tough. Yeah. It's really easy to periodize a program for professional athletes that's getting paid only to run and they don't have a real job. That's the luxury that I have. That's the world that I live in. Doing it for high school kids I think is a lot harder. I think that Dave Frank has a lot of kids that know they want to be runners and they specialize in that at a relatively young age. So Dave can create a program where they have kind of a similar flow of what they're doing and it's consistent and the kids hold each other accountable, which is what Matt was talking about. Dave has kids that he empowers on the team and they empower each other and they hold each other accountable. And there's a culture that Dave has created that I think is probably at the heart of why his program is so successful. When you have other kids that are playing football and soccer, those sports are actually really good for their athletic development as well. So they're getting a lot of the same stuff that we are artificially injecting into, like Dave Frank has to artificially inject a lot of this stuff that maybe a soccer player and a football player doesn't need because they're doing a lot of sprinting and lateral movements during their off season from track. So, I think a lot of times what we're doing as strength and conditioning coaches, when I grew up on a farm in Ohio and I was digging ditches and baling hay and moving rocks and, whatever my dad could get me to do to get me out of the house. So that was my strength and conditioning. A lot of times what we're doing now with strength and conditioning for kids is we are injecting physical challenge into their life because they're not getting that because they grew up in Ohio on a farm next to me. So if they have a very robust athletic year, they probably can get away with less structured strength and conditioning for their running. But if all they're doing is running, they need to have a much better structured program to artificially inject a lot of those elements that the football and the soccer kids are probably getting, and volleyball kids. Does that answer your question? But I appreciate that it's a lot harder with high school kids. Any other questions before we play? All right, let's play.
Once again. Once again. Once again. Once again. Once again. Once again.